Imagine setting out on a journey where your odds of survival were worse than stepping onto a battlefield. That wasn't the reality for medieval soldiers. It was the terrifying truth for pilgrims. While history books glorify knights and their clashes, the quiet, desperate struggle of pilgrims has been largely forgotten. Yet here's the shocking fact. For every one soldier who died in combat during the Middle Ages, as many as 3 pilgrims never made it home. These weren't warriors armed with swords, they were ordinary people, driven by faith, walking straight into a gauntlet of dangers that made war look almost merciful. Picture yourself as one of those travelers, no armor, no army at your back, just a simple cloak and a wooden staff. The road ahead isn't lined with cheering crowds or noble banners. It's a treacherous path where bandits lurk in the shadows, diseases fester in crowded inns, and even the rivers you cross could drown you before you reach the next shrine. Pilgrims didn't face the quick, brutal end of a sword stroke. They endured slow, grinding threat starvation, betrayal, the crushing weight of exhaustion. And the cruelest irony, many of these dangers came disguised as kindness. A warm meal from a stranger could be poisoned. A friendly guide might lead you straight into an ambush. So why did thousands risk everything? What could possibly be worth such suffering? The answer lies in a world where faith wasn't just a belief, it was a lifeline. For medieval Christians, a pilgrimage wasn't optional. It was a sacred duty, a chance to erase sins, heal illnesses, or even escape the grasp of poverty. But behind the spiritual promises lay a reality far darker than most realize. Today, we're peeling back the layers of this forgotten history to uncover the true cost of these journeys. From the moment pilgrims left their villages, they stepped into a world where danger wore many masks, and survival was anything but guaranteed. And it all began with the first lie they were told, that any route was truly safe. The maps pilgrims carried were more like invitations to disaster than guides to salvation. Marked with reassuring symbols of shrines and holy sites, these routes promised divine protection, but in reality, they painted targets on travelers' backs. Thieves knew exactly where to wait, studying the same paths pilgrims trusted. Take the account of Gerald of Wales, a 12th century chronicler who documented how gangs would station themselves near popular stopping points, sometimes even disguising themselves as fellow pilgrims to win trust before striking. One particularly ruthless trick involved guides offering shortcuts through dense forests, only to lead groups straight into prepared ambushes where every belonging, even the clothes on their backs, was stolen. Unlike soldiers marching in disciplined columns with scouts and supply wagons, pilgrims were scattered and vulnerable. Those crumbling Roman roads, once engineering marvels, had become death traps by the Middle Ages. Whole sections would collapse into sinkholes or vanish under seasonal floods, forcing detours into bandit-controlled wilderness. And then there were the forests, dark, sprawling, and alive with threats far older than human greed. Wolves weren't just legends, they were a constant menace, especially for those traveling alone or weakened by hunger. But perhaps the cruelest twist was this: the closer pilgrims got to their destinations, the greater the danger became. Thieves knew desperation made travelers careless. After months of hardship, the sight of a monastery spire or a roadside shrine could lower their guard right as predators moved in. Even the promise of sanctuary was often an illusion. Next time, we'll uncover how the very places meant to offer refuge became some of the deadliest stops along the way. Sanctuaries meant to offer respite became breeding grounds for horrors pilgrims never saw coming. The grand cathedrals and crowded hostels along routes like the Camino de Santiago promised shelter but delivered something far deadlier: a perfect storm of filth and contagion. Brother Anselm, a Benedictine monk stationed at Compostela in the 13th century, wrote of what pilgrims called the holy fever, a vicious illness that left sufferers shivering, delirious, and often dead within days. We now know it as typhus, spread by lice thriving in the damp straw pilgrims slept on. His chilling account describes hostel floors so packed that the sick and healthy lay side by side, their breath mingling in air thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and rotting food. Compare this to the battlefields pilgrims feared so much. A wounded soldier might find himself in a field hospital where crude but deliberate care was given. Bandages boiled, wounds cauterized, orderlies tasked with separating the infected. But in pilgrim infirmaries, no such system existed. The same hands that doled out bread could pass along disease. Water sources, often drawn from contaminated wells near latrines, turned healing shrines into reservoirs of dysentery and cholera. And when the Black Death arrived in 1348, these hubs became super-spreader sites. The very act of touching a relic or kissing a saint's statue, gestures meant to confer divine favor, now transferred plague bacilli from one desperate lips to another. Survival wasn't just about avoiding bandits or starvation. It was a grim calculation: risk the road's solitude or the sanctuary's invisible threats. Even food posed dangers. Local vendors sold spoiled meat to penniless travelers, knowing pilgrims would eat anything to silence their hunger. Water barrels, refilled from questionable streams, often carried parasites that slowly devoured a person from within. The cruelest truth: many pilgrims survived the journey only to collapse within sight of their destination, their bodies giving out just steps from salvation. And yet they kept coming, wave after wave of the faithful, willing to gamble their lives for a chance at redemption. What did they know that made such risks worth taking? The answer lies not in the promises of heaven, but in the desperate realities of life on earth. Starvation crept up on pilgrims like a shadow no cloak could block. Unlike soldiers who marched with supply chains and strict rationing, the Teutonic Knights, for instance, had detailed records ensuring each man received bread, salted meat, and beer. Pilgrims set out with little more than a sack of hardened bread and a wedge of cheese if they were lucky. The Pilgrim's Guide to Rome, written in the 12th century, spills this bitter truth. Vendors along the route peddled rotting fish to travelers too hungry to inspect their meals, knowing these desperate souls would choke it down rather than faint from hunger. And that was in good years. During famines, when crops withered and villages emptied, pilgrims became walking skeletons, gnawing on bark or boiling leather belts for broth. The economics of faith made things worse. Near major shrines, food prices didn't just rise, they soared. A loaf of bread that cost a single penny in a local village might fetch 10 times that just outside Canterbury or Santiago, sold by merchants who saw piety as profit. Thirst was even deadlier. Wells along popular routes, often marked on maps as safe stops, were sometimes poisoned by bandits to weaken travelers before robbing them. There are accounts of entire pilgrim groups collapsing within hours of drinking from a seemingly clear spring, their bodies found with purses cut open and shoes stolen. Yet the greatest danger wasn't the scarcity of food, it was the illusion of generosity. Starving pilgrims learned to mistrust even acts of kindness. A farmer offering a bowl of stew might be lacing it with sedatives to drag unconscious victims into his barn. Monasteries promising charity meals sometimes demanded hidden payments, a traveler's last coin, or worse, their labor for weeks on end. And then there were the Good Samaritans, those smiling locals who invited pilgrims to sleep in their haylofts, only to vanish before dawn with every possession left unguarded. The road taught a brutal lesson: Hunger could kill you slowly, but trust could kill you faster. This was the paradox of pilgrimage. The closer you got to salvation, the more the world seemed determined to drag you into the dirt. And just when exhaustion made vigilance impossible, another threat emerged: the very people who claimed to offer shelter. Even the most well-born pilgrims weren't safe from the knives of so-called hospitality. Take the case of a Burgundian lord traveling to Mont Saint-Michel in 1423, his silver reliquary gleaming at his belt, a gift for the abbey. He stopped at an inn praised in guidebooks for its clean beds and honest keepers. By dawn, his body lay buried in the stable yard. The reliquary melted down and sold before his retainers even noticed his absence. Inquisition records from Avignon later revealed this wasn't some grim exception, it was routine. Taverns along pilgrimage routes often operated as slaughterhouses, their proprietors paying off local officials to look the other way while they preyed on travelers. The irony was brutal. On battlefields, even enemy knights might spare a wealthy prisoner for ransom chivalry's twisted mercy. But in these dimly lit taverns, there were no rules. A merchant from Cologne wrote of watching an innkeeper's wife slip poison into a rival's wine, then calmly pocket the dead man's purse as he choked. Pilgrims quickly learned to fear the very places that promised rest. Some carried their own tin cups to avoid shared vessels doctored with sleeping draughts. Others slept in shifts, one eye always open, trusting no one, not even the crying child at the door who might be a decoy for thieves waiting outside. And if human malice didn't claim you, nature's indifference would. A spring flood could sweep away a bridge overnight, leaving pilgrims stranded for weeks with dwindling supplies. In the Alps, avalanches buried entire groups without warning, their bodies preserved in ice until some future thaw. Unlike wars, where armies could retreat or regroup, pilgrims caught in a storm or landslide had no quartermaster to resupply them, just the relentless elements, as impartial as they were deadly. The road offered no second chances. One misstep into a swollen ford, one night's shelter under an unstable cliff face, and your pilgrimage ended not in penance or peace, but in the unmarked grave of a nameless traveler. The Alps didn't care if you carried a sword or a pilgrim's staff, their fury spared no one. In 1218, an entire group of travelers vanished near Mont Cenis, swallowed whole by an avalanche that left no survivors to bury. Unlike armies who could delay marches or seek shelter during storms, pilgrims had no such luxury. Battlefields might turn to mud, forcing knights to postpone clashes, but nature gave no reprieves to those trudging toward salvation. The same snow that glittered like a divine promise one moment could bury 100 souls the next, their frozen bodies lost until some summer thaw revealed them like grim relics. Then there were the floods, swift, merciless, and utterly indifferent to prayer. In 1287, a sudden downpour turned the Loire River into a roaring beast, sweeping away a vital bridge just as a pilgrim convoy reached its midpoint. Dozens were dragged under, their heavy woolen robes pulling them down like anchors. Soldiers, at least, could retreat to high ground when rivers swelled, but pilgrims often found themselves trapped between rushing waters and bandits who prowled the banks, waiting to pick off survivors. But perhaps the cruelest twist was how human predators exploited these natural horrors. After avalanches, looters would comb the debris for silver crosses and coin pouches, prizing them from stiff fingers. Floods that destroyed bridges forced pilgrims into narrow, easily ambushed detours where thieves lay in wait. Even the weather became a weapon. Locals might warn travelers of an impassable storm ahead, only to lead them straight into a secluded grove where their belongings could be taken without a fight. The wilderness wasn't just a backdrop for pilgrimage. It was an active collaborator in its dangers, shaping every step with threats no faith could fully shield against. And yet, for all its terror, the natural world was at least impartial. The same couldn't be said for the human monsters who wore smiles like disguises. In 1284, Bishop Peter of Rheims issued a chilling decree from his diocese in southern France. Let all who wear the scallop shell of pilgrimage while shedding blood be cast out from God's mercy as wolves in sheep's clothing. His words targeted a growing menace thieves who infiltrated pilgrim bands, their robes hiding daggers instead of devotion. These impostors studied the rituals of the faithful, mimicking their chants and even faking blisters to gain trust. But their goal wasn't salvation, it was the precious votive gifts pilgrims carried home. Silver ex votos shaped like healed limbs, jeweled reliquaries bought at shrines, or pouches of holy earth from Jerusalem that could fetch a year's wages on the black market. Canterbury Cathedral's records reveal the scale of this treachery. Between 1291 and 1310, over 200 thefts were reported by returning pilgrims, nearly all occurring within a day's journey of the shrine. Unlike soldiers who paraded war spoils under armed guard, pilgrims were expected to travel light and unarmed, their treasures vulnerable. A typical entry reads, Margaret of Kent, robbed near Rochester of 1 silver hand wrought for St. Thomas's mercy and 6pence in alms. The pattern was clear. Brigands waited until the return trip, when exhaustion lowered defenses and the weight of sacred souvenirs slowed escape. What made these crimes so brazen was the legal twilight surrounding pilgrim protections. While feudal law punished highway robbery harshly, loopholes abounded. A thief could claim his victim wasn't a true pilgrim if their shell badge was slightly frayed, or argue that stolen relics were unconsecrated and thus fair plunder. Some even exploited sanctuary rites, fleeing to churches after attacks, knowing clergy couldn't forcibly reclaim the goods. The bishop's excommunication was a desperate measure against a system where earthly justice so often failed. These predators perfected a cruel calculus: the holier the site, the richer the prey. Jerusalem-bound pilgrims carried palm fronds blessed in the Holy Land, while those returning from Santiago de Compostela wore lead medallions stamped with the apostles' likeness, both easily melted down. One captured bandit confessed his gang would station lookouts near major shrines, identifying which pilgrims received the most elaborate blessings from priests, a sure sign of wealthy patrons. The sacred had become a currency, and faith itself was the weakest link in any traveler's armor. Yet the greatest danger wasn't the loss of treasure, it was the erosion of trust. Pilgrimages depended on camaraderie, shared meals, and night watches rotated among strangers. When false pilgrims poisoned that well, every outstretched hand became a potential threat. Soldiers might face betrayal on the battlefield, but at least their enemies wore identifiable colors. For the faithful, the road's true terror lay in never knowing who knelt beside you in prayer, a devout companion or a wolf counting your coins. Crossing into another lord's territory stripped pilgrims of what little safety the law could offer. While armies marched under sovereign banners, bound by wartime treaties and codes of chivalry, a lone traveler with a scallop shell badge had no such protections. Take the grim fate of Pierre of Arles, a French weaver hanged in 1294 near Pamplona for the crime of gathering firewood in a royal forest, a violation of Navarre's law he couldn't possibly have known. Local chronicles note his body was left swinging for weeks as a warning, his pilgrim's cloak fluttering in the wind like some macabre banner. Compare this to the fate of captured soldiers. The very same year, English knights taken at the Battle of Ferns were ransomed after 2 months of comfortable confinement, their treatment governed by elaborate prisoner exchange agreements. Feudal borders turned legal systems into minefields. A pilgrim might leave France under the king's peace, only to find themselves in a county where petty lords enforced arbitrary laws with brutal efficiency. Toll collectors became predators, inventing fees for imaginary offenses, a tax on walking sticks, a levy for muddying roads with foreign boots. In Lombardy, travelers reported being forced to pay breathing dues simply for passing through certain valleys. Worse still, many regions practiced right of wreck, where anyone dying without local kin had their possessions seized by the lord. This turned pilgrim corpses into revenue streams, their pouches slit open before the ground could swallow them. Sea pilgrimages magnified these dangers tenfold. At least on land, a wrong turn might lead to a beating or robbery, but the Mediterranean and English Channel offered no second chances. Ships overloaded with penitents routinely capsized in sudden storms, their passengers' heavy wool habits dragging them under before prayers could be gasped. Pirates lurked near holy ports like Venice and Jaffa, knowing pilgrims carried votive gifts worth more than cargo. The most chilling accounts come from Moorish corsairs who specifically targeted Christian pilgrim vessels not for slaves, but for the lead amply filled with holy water from the Jordan River, melted down into bullets to turn faith against itself. Yet the sea's greatest cruelty was its indifference. No treaty governed its storms, no law bound its waves. When the Sanctus Nicolaus sank off Cyprus in 1332 with 300 pilgrims aboard, not a single lord was held accountable for the rotten timbers that doomed them. On land, even the worst bandit might face justice if caught, but the deep answered to no one, swallowing the faithful and faithless alike without witness or reckoning. The White Ship disaster of 1120 wasn't just a tragedy, it was a slaughterhouse disguised as a shortcut. When the vessel packed with 300 nobles, including King Henry I's heir, struck a rock off Normandy and sank, the death toll dwarfed most medieval battles. But what made this catastrophe emblematic wasn't the bloodline of its victims, it was the sheer mundanity of their fate. Unlike soldiers who perished with swords in hand, these pilgrims drowned in darkness, their screams swallowed by waves as indifferent as the rocks that gutted the hull. The Channel had no treaties, no prisoners of war, just a wet grave for those who trusted the wrong captain. Mediterranean waters offered no mercy either. While knights captured in battle could expect ransom negotiations, pilgrims seized by Barbary corsairs faced a grimmer calculus. Slave markets in Algiers and Tunis prized Christian pilgrims not for their labor but for their connections. A wealthy traveler's family might pay handsomely, but ordinary pilgrims, they vanished into a system far crueler than any dungeon. Catalan merchant records from 1352 detail how corsairs would strip captives naked, inspecting teeth and scars like livestock, then sort them into lots, the young for galleys, the old for quarry mines, the infirm left to rot in holding pens. At least prisoners of war had their status acknowledged. Here, a pilgrim's vows meant nothing. Yet the true horror wasn't the violence itself, it was the gnawing uncertainty that poisoned every voyage. Soldiers prepared for battle with drills and strategy, but pilgrims could only clutch their rosaries and pray as creaking timbers groaned under storm surges. A Genoese sailor's journal from 1408 describes the haunting ritual of pilgrims tying themselves to masts with ropes, not for safety, but to ensure their bodies might be identified if washed ashore. The sea didn't fight fair. It offered no parley, no rules of engagement, just the capricious whims of wind and current. And when survivors did stumble onto foreign shores, their ordeal wasn't over. A Flemish pilgrim who washed up near Tripoli in 1211 wrote of being arrested as a spy, his pilgrim badge mistaken for some enemy sigil. For soldiers, surrender meant predictable captivity. For pilgrims, every stroke of luck came with fresh razors hidden beneath, a rescue that led to imprisonment. a kind stranger who demanded payment in servitude. The road's dangers at least followed familiar patterns: bandits, hunger, foul weather. But the sea, it taught pilgrims a darker lesson. Salvation and annihilation could be separated by nothing more than a shift in the wind. The journals of medieval pilgrims crackle with a fear soldiers never had to face: the terror of vanishing without witness. While knights marched to war surrounded by brothers in arms, pilgrims trudged forward with only the whispers of their own doubts for company. Consider the diary of Brother Elias, a Benedictine monk traveling to Rome in 1389. Each nightfall feels like a little death. The road swallows men whole, leaving no trace but a dropped rosary or a trampled hat. His words capture the isolating dread of journeys where disappearance was common enough that families often waited years before declaring a pilgrim dead. This solitude bred a unique psychological torment. Soldiers drew strength from shared purpose: the clank of armor, the rallying cries, the knowledge that their sacrifice would be sung by minstrels. But pilgrims, their suffering was silent, their heroism anonymous. The phenomenon now called Jerusalem Syndrome reveals how this pressure could shatter minds. Records from the Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem describe pilgrims arriving after months of hardship only to collapse into delirium, convinced they were biblical figures or screaming that the city's stones were bleeding. One woman spent weeks insisting she was Mary Magdalene, washing travelers' feet with her own hair until forcibly restrained. Financial ruin waited like a trapdoor beneath every step. Unlike soldiers who received wages or shares of plunder, pilgrims drained their life savings for the privilege of suffering. The ledger of Thomas Chantry, a London baker who pawned his shop to fund his 1403 pilgrimage, lays bare the math of devotion. Sold my oven for £12, spent 8 on the journey, returned to debts no miracle could erase. His story was typical. Those who survived the road often came home to find their trades usurped, their families reduced to begging. The cruelest twist. While a wounded soldier might be pensioned or granted land, pilgrims received no such safety net. Churches praised their sacrifices but offered no alms for ruined men. Some resorted to selling the very relics they'd risked their lives to obtain: a fragment of the true cross bartered for a loaf of bread, a vial of Jordan water traded for a night's shelter. The road didn't just test faith, it devoured futures, leaving even the victorious hollow-eyed and broken. And for those who never returned, their families inherited only questions and the crushing weight of hope that refused to die. Florentine banking records from the 14th century expose a heartbreaking truth: pilgrimage wasn't just a spiritual journey, it was a financial suicide mission. Take the case of Giovanni di Paolo, a Sienese farmer who in 1321 pledged his olive groves to the Medici Bank for a loan of 50 florins, enough to fund his wife's pilgrimage to Assisi after she vowed to seek St. Francis's intercession for their sick child. The ledger's cold notation tells the rest: land seized, harvest forfeit. Unlike soldiers who could plunder conquered towns or ransom prisoners, pilgrims had no such recourse. Every coin spent was a gamble with no earthly return. The contrast with military economics couldn't be starker. Mercenary companies like the White Company kept meticulous payrolls. A foot soldier might earn 6 florins a month plus a share of spoils. Even defeated knights could barter their armor for passage home. But pilgrims, their only currency was faith. Venetian ship manifests reveal families pawning heirlooms to buy passage to Jerusalem. A silver candlestick traded for a berth next to leaky bilge pumps, a daughter's dowry chest swapped for moldy biscuits. The truly desperate resorted to body pledges, signing contracts that bound them to years of servitude if they couldn't repay loans upon return. Worse than the financial ruin was the betrayal that often followed. The Diary of Heinrich von Staden, a German merchant pilgrim, recounts how his own traveling companion, a man who'd shared bread with him for weeks, vanished one night with their pooled funds, leaving Heinrich to beg his way to Rome. Church courts overflowed with such cases, pilgrims accusing fellow travelers of stealing relic pouches sewn into their garments, or conspiring with innkeepers to drug and rob them. These weren't isolated incidents but a systemic rot. Florentine notary records show pilgrims increasingly drafting mutual oath contracts before departure, swearing on relics to protect each other's goods. Yet even these often failed. In 1354, an entire group from Lyon was found starved to death in the Apennines. Their leader had absconded with the communal purse, leaving them unable to buy food. The bitter lesson: on the road to salvation, your greatest threat might be the very person praying beside you at each wayside shrine. The final irony lay in what awaited those who miraculously returned. While victorious soldiers paraded through cities with spoils, successful pilgrims came home to crippling debts. Tax rolls from Burgundy show entire villages where every third farm bore the mark of ecclesiastical seizure, fields repossessed by monasteries that had funded pilgrimages. Some resorted to selling the relics they'd suffered to obtain, creating a macabre secondary market. A 13th century Parisian pawn register lists one thorn purportedly from Christ's crown, exchanged for a sack of grain. This was pilgrimage's hidden toll, not just the bodies left on distant roads, but the lives unraveled in its wake. Unlike war, which at least offered the slim chance of plunder, the journey to salvation guaranteed only one certainty: whether you reached your destination or not, poverty would be waiting. Venice's canals ran red with more than just reflected sunsets in 1382. That summer, a pilgrim circle bound for Rome discovered horror in their midst, not from bandits or storms, but from the hands breaking bread with them each night. Sister Lucia's diary, preserved in the Doge's archives, records how their group of 20 slowly dwindled to 12 over 3 weeks, victims not of the road's expected dangers, but of a killer hiding behind the sign of the cross. The poisoner, a man calling himself Brother Matteo, had joined them at Padua, his gentle manner and knowledge of Latin masking his true trade. By day, he led prayers. By night, he stirred arsenic into shared wine flasks, carefully selecting victims whose jewelry or coin purses caught his eye. This wasn't battlefield deception where spies wore enemy colors. Pilgrimage betrayal cut deeper because it weaponized trust itself. Compare Matteo's methods to medieval warfare's rules of engagement. When the French planted a double agent in the Burgundian camp during the 100 Years' War, the man's eventual exposure earned him a swift execution, but first, a military tribunal. Matteo faced no such reckoning. By the time Lucia grew suspicious, noting how consistently the good brother volunteered to bless their meals, 7 pilgrims already lay in unmarked graves along the Via Emilia. Their deaths didn't even merit investigations, just hurried burials under muttered prayers, the road swallowing evidence as quickly as bodies. The physical toll of such journeys paled beside this psychological carnage. Pilgrims already endured feet shredded by cobblestones, backs bent under makeshift packs, and bellies hollowed by hunger. But Matteo's crimes did something worse. They turned every gesture of fellowship into a potential threat. Where soldiers could distrust anyone not wearing their livery, pilgrims had no such visual cues. That warm hand pressing a water skin into yours might belong to a saint or a murderer. After Matteo's eventual capture, betrayed by his own greed when he tried selling a victim's silver crucifix to the very priest hearing confessions, survivors reported new rituals: sniffing wine for bitterness, tearing bread into equal portions where all could watch, even sleeping with purses tied around their necks like nooses. Bodily suffering was expected. Blistered feet could be salved, empty stomachs eventually filled. but the wounds left by such betrayals, those festered long after the journey ended. Lucia's final entry before reaching Rome captures this perfectly. We kiss the apostles' tomb with lips that still taste of poison, and wonder if heaven itself holds any trust unbroken. The road's true test wasn't surviving the elements, it was enduring what the journey revealed about human nature. Bones don't lie, and the skeletal remains of medieval pilgrims tell a story of suffering written in stress fractures and twisted joints. Forensic anthropologists studying burial sites along the Via Francigena found something startling. Over 60% of pilgrim skeletons showed signs of repetitive strain injuries, with telltale microfractures in feet, ankles, and knees. These weren't the clean breaks of battlefield trauma, but the slow, grinding damage of bodies pushed beyond endurance. Picture walking 20 miles a day for months in crude leather shoes, your feet pounding against uneven cobblestones until the bones themselves began to splinter. One particularly haunting case from a mass grave near Canterbury revealed a pilgrim whose heel bone had fused abnormally, a desperate adaptation to constant pain, as if his very skeleton had tried to armor itself against the road's brutality. Now compare that to the cavalrymen of the same era. While pilgrims trudged until their bodies broke Knight's Road, examination of noble burial sites shows a stark difference. Horseback riders developed thicker hip bones and stronger spinal columns from years in the saddle, their skeletons reshaped by privilege. A knight might cover 40 miles in a day without fatigue, his horse absorbing the punishment that would cripple a pilgrim. Even their injuries differed. Cavalry bones bear the marks of clean fractures from falls or blows, wounds that could heal with proper care. But pilgrims, their ailments were chronic, their pain invisible until it was too late. Yet physical torment was only half the battle. Arriving at a long-sought shrine often meant facing a new kind of predation, not from bandits, but from the very guardians of holiness. English court rolls from 1341 document the case of a shrine keeper at Walsingham Court swapping out genuine relics for fakes, then selling the authentic items to wealthy patrons. This wasn't some lone scammer, it was systemic. Pilgrim badges excavated near Compostela show crude lead cores beneath thin silver plating, proof that even symbols of devotion had become profit centers. The worst offenses happened behind closed doors. In one notorious incident at Rocamadour, a monk was found charging pilgrims extra to touch the true Black Madonna statue, while secretly directing them to a replica, pocketing the difference. These weren't just financial crimes, they struck at the heart of pilgrimage itself. After months of agony, pilgrims might discover the healing waters they'd walked 1,000 miles to reach were nothing but well water blessed by a corrupt priest. The betrayal cut deeper than any bandit's knife because this time the thieves wore vestments instead of masks, and so the cruelest lesson revealed itself. The road's hardships might break your body, but the shrines could shatter your faith. What good were blistered feet and hollow cheeks if the relics you kissed were pasteboard, the holy water drawn from a rain barrel? Pilgrimage demanded everything, and for many, it gave back only lies wrapped in gilded paper. The holiest sites in Christendom had become market stalls, and the relics pilgrims wept to touch were often clever fakes. In Canterbury Cathedral's shadow, vendors sold genuine fragments of St. Thomas Becket's bones, never mind that the saint's remains were supposedly sealed in a golden shrine upstairs. Chaucer's pardoner, that silver-tongued hawker of pig's bones passed off as saints' relics, wasn't just satire, he was documentary. Church investigation records from York in 1392 reveal a cottage industry of forgery. Goat skulls marketed as John the Baptist's, rusty nails baptized as fragments of the true cross, even donkey teeth sold as teeth of martyrs. The trade thrived because desperation made pilgrims easy marks. After months of hardship, who would dare question the authenticity of a relic when their salvation might depend on it. Compare this to the blunt honesty of wartime plunder. When knights looted a town, they made no secret of their theft. Silver candlesticks were melted down in plain sight, tapestries rolled up and hauled away. But relic fraud was predation disguised as piety. A Burgundian merchant's account from 1405 describes watching a monk in Rome rub chicken bones with ochre to mimic age, then sell them as relics of Saint Sebastian to weeping pilgrims. The scam worked because faith demanded suspension of disbelief. Where a soldier might inspect stolen goods for quality, pilgrims feared divine retribution for doubting a relic's provenance. The rot went higher than wandering charlatans. Bishops and abbots turned blind eyes, or worse, took cuts. In 1310, the Archbishop of Tours was caught selling counterfeit pilgrimage certificates, absolving sins for a fee without the bother of actual travel. These weren't rogue operators, but part of a system that monetized devotion. Even the great pilgrimage centers played the game. Walsingham's famous holy milk relic, supposedly the Virgin Mary's breast milk, was quietly replaced with goat's milk whenever supplies ran low, as attested by a disgruntled sacristan's confession in Norwich's ecclesiastical court records. Political winds fanned the flames. Local lords who should have protected pilgrims instead taxed their vulnerability. In Gascony, robber barons demanded safe passage fees that were little better than ransom, knowing churches would excommunicate anyone who refused to pay. The French crown's attempt to regulate these abuses in 1351 collapsed when regional governors realized pilgrim tolls filled their coffers better than any tax. Unlike wartime tributes, which at least bought temporary peace, these payments guaranteed nothing. Bandits still prowled, innkeepers still cheated, and relic sellers still lied. The final insult: many fake relics came from battlefields themselves. After the sack of Constantinople in 1204, enterprising Venetians bundled random bones from the carnage and sold them as martyrs' remains. A grisly symmetry emerged. Soldiers stripped churches of gold during war. Then merchants repurposed the chaos to fuel pilgrimage fraud in peacetime. At least plunderers were honest thieves. The road to salvation, it seemed, was paved with more than good intentions. It was built on lies wrapped in sacred vestments, where the greatest sinners often wore mitres instead of masks. Pilgrimage routes became chessboards where kings and popes moved living pieces in their power struggles, and ordinary travelers paid the price. Take the infamous clash between Henry II and Thomas Becket. When the Archbishop's murder turned Canterbury into a martyr's shrine overnight, Henry didn't just allow pilgrimages there, he actively promoted them. But this wasn't piety, it was political theater. By encouraging subjects to visit Becket's tomb, Henry could publicly atone for the murder while quietly monitoring who made the journey. Rolls from the Royal Exchequer show payments to spies posing as pilgrims, their real mission to identify nobles whose devotion to Becket might signal disloyalty to the crown. Compare this to the straightforward allegiances of war. When Henry fought his rebellious sons, alliances were clear-cut. Knights wore their lord's colors, and betrayals were met with swift retribution. But pilgrimage routes blurred those lines. A noble traveling to Canterbury might genuinely seek salvation or be secretly building alliances with ecclesiastical powers. The same roads that carried penitents also ferried coded messages between bishops and barons, their couriers disguised as humble wayfarers. Unlike wartime, where enemies faced each other across defined battle lines, pilgrimage turned every stranger into a potential conspirator. The dangers didn't end at the shrine. Returning pilgrims carried more than just relics, they bore invisible targets. In 1283, French agents intercepted a group of English pilgrims near Calais, searching their baggage for letters from the Pope to anti-royal factions. Those caught carrying such documents weren't just robbed, they vanished into castle dungeons. Their families told they'd fallen to bandits. At least soldiers captured in battle had rules governing their treatment. Pilgrims, their disappearances were conveniently blamed on the very highwaymen kings often secretly funded. Even the landscape became weaponized. When Philip Augustus of France wanted to weaken English influence in Aquitaine, he didn't send armies. He let bandits thrive along the pilgrimage routes to Compostela, knowing the resulting chaos would strangle the region's economy. Toll records from Bordeaux show pilgrim traffic dropping by half during his reign, inns shuttering as travelers avoided the area. Wartime destruction at least rebuilt over time, but the erosion of trust in these sacred highways lingered for generations. The cruelest twist awaited those who made it home. While victorious soldiers paraded through cheering crowds, returning pilgrims often found suspicion waiting at their doorsteps. A knight back from campaign could prove his loyalty by displaying captured banners, but how did you explain those weeks spent in a foreign bishop's company? Tax rolls from Kent reveal pilgrim families suddenly paying higher levies, a quiet punishment for potential disloyalty. Some were even forced to sell the very relics they'd suffered to obtain, their hard-won tokens of faith becoming evidence of suspicious foreign contact. This was pilgrimage's hidden battlefield, one where trust was the first casualty, and the war never truly ended. At least in combat, you knew who your enemies were. On the road to salvation, even a king's smile could hide a knife. The journey's end should have been safe, but for many pilgrims, the final miles were the deadliest of all. After surviving bandits, storms, and disease, travelers let their guard down within sight of home, unaware that local thieves had been counting the days until their return. Sussex court rolls from 1324 document this grim pattern. Ambushes along the Ashdown forest trails where pilgrims were robbed not just of coins, but of the very proof of their salvation, the handwritten indulgences granted at shrines. These parchments, meant to wipe away sins, became death warrants when flaunted too openly. One entry details a miller's son caught with 6 such documents tucked in his belt, all torn from victims whose throats were slit near East Grinstead. Unlike highwaymen who struck at random, these predators studied the rhythms of pilgrimage, knowing exactly when weary travelers would trudge back with treasures too precious to hide. Women faced a double peril. While male pilgrims might lose their purses or badges, female travelers risked everything. The same Sussex records note a cluster of attacks near Lewes where returning women were dragged into thickets, their pilgrim gowns stitched with telltale shell patterns making them easy targets. Some were robbed, others vanished entirely, their families left to wonder if they'd ever truly come home. Church courts treated these crimes with shocking leniency. A knight stealing a relic might face excommunication, but a peasant assaulting a female pilgrim, often just a fine paid in chickens or wool. The cruelty of these homecoming ambushes lay in their intimacy. Unlike foreign bandits who spoke strange tongues, these thieves were neighbors' men who'd watched families weep at farewells months earlier, now counting those same tears as profit. A Canterbury pardoner's ledger from 1348 exposes the trade. Indulgences bought for 12 pence at the shrine re-sold for 20 in London's back alleys, their original owners lying nameless in ditches. For pilgrims who'd endured starvation and storms, this final betrayal cut deepest of all. The road's hardships could be survived, but the knowledge that home itself had teeth. That lingered long after the blisters healed, and then there were the children. Boys sent to fetch returning parents from crossroads sometimes found corpses instead, their pilgrim badges pried loose with knives. In 1361, a Sussex coroner's inquest described a particularly gruesome discovery. A girl of no more than 10, her hand still clutching the scallop shell pouch she'd sewn for her mother's return. The pouch was empty. The road gave no mercy, not even to those who never left their villages. Marjorie Kemp's trembling hands clutched her pilgrim badge as the innkeeper's shadow loomed over her in that Roman alleyway. The 15th century mystic's own memoir, the first autobiography in English, spares no detail. Drunk men pawing at her robes, her desperate prayers drowned by their laughter, the moment she realized no one would intervene. For women pilgrims, the road wasn't just dangerous, it was a gauntlet of gendered threats no male traveler ever faced. While medieval armies often barred women entirely from campaigns with harsh penalties for camp followers, pilgrimage routes forced female penitents into unprotected spaces where their faith made them targets. A soldier's armor might deflect arrows, but no cloak could shield a woman from the assumptions of predators who saw solitary travelers as invitations. The contrast with wartime protections couldn't be starker. When noble women like Elena of Aquitaine accompanied crusades, they traveled with armed retinues and fortified tents, privileges unthinkable for common pilgrim women. Chivalric codes at least paid lip service to defending ladies, however hypocritically, but no such courtesy extended to Marjorie and her ilk. Church records from Canterbury reveal a grim double standard. While male pilgrims reported thefts to sympathetic clerics, women describing assaults were often accused of tempting their attackers through impropriety. A Lincolnshire midwife's 1420 petition to the Archbishop survives in tattered parchment, her accusation against a fellow pilgrim, dismissed with the note, she ought not to have journeyed without kin. Even the landscape conspired against them. Men could relieve themselves discreetly by roadside bushes. Women needing privacy had to venture further into wooded areas precisely where assailants lurked. Marjorie's near miss in Rome wasn't unique. Italian notary logs from 1395 document 17 assaults on female pilgrims near Viterbo's public latrines in a single season. These weren't random crimes but calculated patterns exploiting the biological realities of long-distance travel. Then came the silent killer, medical neglect. A knight taking an arrow to the thigh might endure agony, but field surgeons would at least attempt extraction and cautery. For pilgrim women suffering, female complaints from exhaustion or assault. No such care existed. Male monastic infirmaries often turned them away, citing modesty, while local midwives charged extortionate fees, the Ledger of St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London lists just 3 pilgrim women treated for womb sickness in 1408 versus 200 male pilgrims treated for dysentery that same year. The final insult lay in the relics themselves. Many shrines barred menstruating women from touching sacred objects, forcing them to wait outside while male companions received blessings. Even salvation had a gender gap. Marjorie's tears of frustration so copious they earned her the nickname, the Weeping Mystic, weren't just spiritual fervor. They were the rage of a woman who'd walked 1,000 miles only to find heaven's gates half shut. A pilgrim's medical kit often held more superstition than salvation, a jumble of crushed beetles, powdered unicorn horn, and worst of all, so-called mummy powder. This grotesque ingredient, scraped from looted Egyptian tombs, was sold by charlatans as a cure all for everything from dysentery to broken bones. A merchant's ledger from Marseille in 1374 lists a single ounce costing more than a peasant's monthly wages, promising the strength of pharaohs. Yet when forensic scientists examined pilgrim graves near Mont Saint-Michel, they found no trace of healing, just skeletons with abscessed teeth and bones knitted crookedly, proof these remedies failed even basic ailments. Battlefield medicine, by contrast, was evolving into something resembling science. While pilgrims rubbed dubious ointments into their blisters, military surgeons like Henry de Monville were compiling detailed manuals on wound stitching and fracture setting. His 1403 treatise Chirurgy advised cleaning tools with vinegar and using spider webs to staunch bleeding, crude by modern standards, but leagues ahead of mummied dust. The difference: war forced innovation. A knight with a gangrenous arrow wound couldn't wait for prayers to work. Pilgrims, however, were trapped in a system that prioritized faith over facts, where suffering was seen as part of the redemption process. This divergence played out in gruesome statistics. Records from the Teutonic Knights field hospitals show 60% of limb amputation patients surviving grim odds, but far better than the fate awaiting pilgrims who trusted shrine healers. At Canterbury's infirmary, a chronicler noted pilgrims routinely died from infected scratches that any army barber surgeon could have cleaned. The bitter truth. While war bred practical solutions, pilgrimage nurtured exploitation. Quacks peddled Jerusalem balm, actually just rancid olive oil to travelers too desperate to question. The ultimate cruelty lay in the illusion of divine protection. Churches displayed jars of angel feathers, goose down, and tears of the Virgin rock crystal dripped with wax as proof of heavenly favor. Pilgrims clung to these symbols, believing their faith alone would ward off harm. But the bones tell a different story. A mass grave near Tours holds 17 pilgrims who perished within a day's walk of the shrine they sought, their bodies showing no signs of violence, just the slow collapse of malnourished immune systems. They hadn't been robbed or attacked, they'd simply trusted their relics more than common sense. Surgeons learn from each corpse on the battlefield. Pilgrim healers, though, they kept selling the same lies season after season because the road to salvation was paved with gold, and no one cared if it led over a cliff of broken promises. Countless medieval chronicles tell of pilgrims saved by divine intervention, a sudden gust of wind pushing them from a cliff's edge, a mysterious stranger appearing to fight off bandits. But dig deeper into church records, and a harsher truth emerges. The York Archbishop's Register from 1345 lists over 300 pilgrim deaths along the northern routes that year. Only 7 were recorded as miraculously preserved. The rest anonymous bones in unmarked graves, their stories reduced to a single line: unknown traveler found near Doncaster. These weren't tales of guardian angels, they were statistical inevitabilities. The lucky few survivors spun into propaganda to keep the pilgrimage industry thriving. Now picture a knight preparing for battle. His faith might be just as strong, but he didn't rely on celestial protection alone. Chainmail clinked over his torso, a bassinet helmet shielded his skull, and a well-honed broadsword hung at his hip, each piece tested, practical, bought with hard coin rather than hopeful prayers. The contrast couldn't be starker. While pilgrims clutched lead badges stamped with saints' faces, soldiers invested in layered defenses that didn't depend on divine whims. A 14th century armorer's manual from Milan lays it out plainly. 16 hours to temper a breastplate, 20 to rivet gauntlets, no shortcuts, lest the wearer pay in blood. Pilgrims got promises, soldiers got physics, yet the cruelest disparity lay in remembrance. Fallen knights were buried under carved effigies, their names etched in stone. The Burgundian chronicler Chaselain records how even lowly men-at-arms received proper rights if they died in service. Their families granted pensions, their graves marked with iron crosses. But pilgrims, the same chronicle notes a ditch outside Chartres filled with 200 corpses during a plague year, their pilgrim badges still pinned to rotting tunics. No names, no markers, just a mass grave that became fertilizer for the next season's wheat. Faith couldn't stop a dagger's thrust or purify tainted water. And while soldiers marched home to ballads praising their deeds, pilgrims who vanished left behind only silence and the uneasy suspicion that their sacrifices might have been for nothing. The road to salvation, it seemed, was paved with more forgotten dead than answered prayers. The numbers don't lie pilgrimage routes were deadlier than the bloodiest battlefields of the Middle Ages. Take the Norman invasion of England in 1066, often held up as one of history's most brutal military campaigns. Records suggest roughly 1 in 10 soldiers perished at Hastings, a staggering toll for medieval warfare. Yet compare that to the pilgrimage roads. Contemporary accounts from Cluny Abbey estimate 1 in 5 travelers never returned home. Picture 2 lines of men setting out, one armed with swords toward battle, the other with wooden staffs toward shrines. By journey's end, twice as many pilgrims would be missing. These weren't just abstract risks. The annals of Winchester document a single season in 1289 when 300 pilgrims vanished along the Via Francigena, their fates guessed at from scattered belongings. A rusted knife here, a waterlogged prayer book there. Meanwhile, muster rolls from the same era show English garrisons in Gascony losing fewer men to combat in a full year. The disparity becomes even starker when you consider context. Soldiers expected violence. Their training, armor, and unit cohesion gave them tools to survive. Pilgrims walked into the same dangers unarmed, alone, and often malnourished before they'd taken a single step. Why would anyone accept such odds? The answer lies in a world where risk wasn't measured in percentages but in divine currency. Medieval Christians believed suffering purified the soul. Each blister, each hungry night, each brush with death scrubbed away sin like spiritual sandpaper. A knight might earn glory on the battlefield, but a pilgrim's sacrifice promised something greater, eternal salvation. This wasn't blind faith, it was calculated investment. Church ledgers from Canterbury show families pooling resources to send one member on pilgrimage, viewing their potential death not as tragedy but as transcendent offering. The calculus grew even more compelling when you consider earthly rewards. Surviving pilgrims returned with indulgences shortening purgatory by decades, documents so valuable they were sometimes stolen mid-journey. Others carried relics believed to cure ailments, their power proportional to the suffering endured to obtain them. A Flemish merchant's account from 1322 describes trading his daughter's dowry for a pilgrimage to Rome, reasoning her arthritis cure would fetch more suitors than any chest of linens. Yet beneath these spiritual transactions lurked a darker truth. For many, pilgrimage wasn't a choice but the least terrible option. Famine years saw surges in penitential travel as starving peasants swapped certain death at home for uncertain salvation on the road. Criminal pardons often required pilgrimage, better to risk bandits than the hangman's noose. Even the chronically ill gambled that the journey might kill them faster than their disease. What looks like devotion in parchment records often reads like desperation between the lines. The road's lethality wasn't incidental, it was the point. Just as gold is purified by fire, medieval theology taught that souls required ordeal. When Gerald of Wales wrote of pilgrims deliberately choosing winter treks through wolf-infested passes, he wasn't condemning their folly but praising their zeal. Danger wasn't an obstacle to salvation, it was the furnace where salvation was forged. This mindset transformed statistics from warnings into badges of honor. The more perilous the route, the greater its spiritual yield. Modern minds might struggle to comprehend such logic, but the proof lingers in Europe's landscape. Every roadside cross, every weathered shrine, every unmarked grave whispers the same truth. Faith could move mountains, but it couldn't stop the road from claiming its due. Bernard of Clairvaux, the fiery 12th century monk whose words could move armies, once wrote that the road to heaven is paved with suffering. each step a lash that scourges sin from the soul. To modern ears, this sounds like madness, but in an age where life was brutal and brief, pain wasn't just inevitable, it was sacred currency. While knights earned land and titles for their valor, pilgrims sought something far more enduring, a soul scrubbed clean by hardship. Bernard's letters describe blistered feet as rosaries of flesh, hunger pangs as God's chisel, and bandit attacks as divine examinations. Where a soldier's wounds might earn him a lord's favor, a pilgrim's scars were receipts for heavenly credit. This theology transformed suffering into a kind of spiritual alchemy. Take the case of Thibaut of Champagne, a wealthy knight who traded his armor for sackcloth after a near-fatal illness. His 13th century memoir details how he deliberately chose the most treacherous routes to Jerusalem, wading through swamps, sleeping in caves, even binding his own festering wounds with nettles to multiply his merits. Meanwhile, his former comrades were jousting for castles and silver. The contrast couldn't be starker. One man's pain purchased earthly power, while the others bought ethereal grace. Modern psychology might call this masochism, but medieval minds saw calculus. Church ledger books from Vézelay Abbey show pilgrims paying extra to climb the sacred hill on their knees, the additional bleeding literally quantified as indulgence days off purgatory. A single drop of blood from a scraped knee could erase a month of sin, while a broken bone might wipe a decade clean. Soldiers kept trophies, captured banners, notched swords. Pilgrims collected scars like holy receipts, their bodies becoming walking ledgers of spiritual debt repaid. Yet this economy of agony had a dark loophole. The rich could hire substitutes. When gout-ridden Count Fulk of Anjou funded 3 paupers to walk to Compostela in his place, theologians debated whether their suffering could truly cleanse his soul. The answer, a resounding yes, provided the Count paid enough alms to the church. Suddenly, pilgrimage became a commodity, with the poorest selling their pain to the highest bidder. Indenture contracts from Marseille reveal landless laborers signing away years to walk as proxy penitents, their blisters paying another man's way to paradise. The echoes of this mindset still haunt us today. Marathon runners pushing through the wall, influencers documenting extreme fasts, even the cult of overwork, all carry faint whispers of Bernard's vision. But where medieval pilgrims sought salvation, modern seekers chase self-actualization. A corporate lawyer pulling an all-nighter isn't thinking of heaven, she's banking on promotion. The calculus has changed, but the human capacity to endure and even romanticize suffering remains eerily constant. Perhaps that's the most enduring legacy of pilgrimage, proof that pain, when wrapped in meaning, becomes bearable. The knights of old are dust, their battles reduced to museum dioramas. But every time someone chooses the harder path, not for gold or glory, but for some deeper reckoning, the ghost of a barefoot pilgrim smiles. Centuries may separate medieval pilgrims from today's refugees, but the roads they walk tell eerily similar stories. Swap scallop shell badges for tattered backpacks and the Via Francigena for the Balkan route, and you'll find the same desperate calculus. Risk dying on the journey or stay and perish where you are. Modern migrants crossing the Mediterranean in overloaded rafts face drowning threats as relentless as any pilgrim swallowing avalanche, except today's waters are patrolled by coast guards instead of corsairs. The difference: medieval pilgrims chose their suffering for spiritual rewards. Today's travelers endure it simply to live. Take the Sahara crossing, where bones bleach under the same sun that once baked pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. Human traffickers now play the role of medieval bandits, abandoning those who can't keep up, just as ruthless guides once left sick travelers to rot in ditches. A Nigerian woman's account from 2019 mirrors 12th century chronicles. They promised us safe passage, then took our money and vanished when the sandstorms came. Replace poisoned wells with sabotaged water trucks, and the playbook hasn't changed. Yet there's one grim upgrade. Medieval thieves at least waited for pilgrims to reach the woods. Modern predators use technology to hunt. GPS trackers planted in migrants' bags lead Libyan militias straight to hideouts, while social media scams replicate the relic frauds of old fake visas sold like bogus indulgences, both peddling hope they'll never deliver. Even the sanctuaries echo the past. Just as pilgrims found typhus in monastery hostels, refugees today crowd into disease-ridden detention camps, where barbed wire does what crumbling castle walls once did, corral the desperate while pretending to protect them. The most haunting parallel lies in the silence. Pilgrim bones dissolved into unmarked graves. Today, the Mediterranean's floor is littered with smartphones' digital tombstones for those whose names no one will ever call. When archaeologists someday sift through these tragedies, they'll find the same story written across 800 years. Borders change, but human suffering walks the same endless road. And perhaps that's the hardest truth. We like to believe progress has made the world safer, but for millions, the journey still demands the same terrible price it did when Chaucer's pilgrims set out for Canterbury. The only real difference, today's travelers don't even have the comfort of believing their suffering earns them heaven. Medieval pilgrims walked a path where every mile could be their last, not in the organized chaos of battle, but in the silent, grinding terror of the open road. Unlike soldiers who marched with shields and supply lines, these travelers faced war's dangers without any of its protections. Bandits replaced enemy troops, starvation stood in for sieges, and disease spread like invisible arrows in crowded hostels. Even the landscape itself became an adversary, with swollen rivers and avalanches as deadly as any ambush. Pilgrimage stripped away the structure of warfare, leaving only its brutality, endured alone under the banner of faith. The sheer scale of suffering is written in the bones left along routes like the Camino de Santiago, whitened by sun and rain until they blended with the pebbles underfoot. Chroniclers spoke of roads paved with the pious, where winter winds scoured flesh from skeletons still clutching their rosaries. What kind of devotion justifies such risks? The answer lies in a world where salvation wasn't metaphor but currency. Each blister, each night spent shivering in ditches, each coin stolen by thieves was a deposit in a heavenly bank. A soldier's wounds might earn him land or titles, but a pilgrim's scars bought something no lord could grant: absolution. Yet the most haunting legacy isn't the deaths themselves, it's how casually they were accepted. Church ledgers recorded relic sales in meticulous detail, but often reduced pilgrim fatalities to single-line notations. Lost near Burgos, God rest his soul. These weren't tragedies, they were expected sacrifices, as routine as crop failures or plagues. Modern hikers tracing these routes today, equipped with Gore-Tex and GPS, can scarcely fathom the courage or desperation it took to step onto those roads with nothing but a wooden staff and a prayer. So the next time you board a train or buckle into a plane seat, pause for a moment. That safety you take for granted was bought by centuries of suffering, of pilgrims who vanished into storms or bled out in roadside ditches, their stories erased by time. Their journeys remind us that progress isn't just faster travel, it's the luxury of assuming we'll make it home. Let's hear your thoughts. What risks would you take for something you believe in? And how far would you walk before the road broke you? Drop your answers below. We're all just modern pilgrims after all, searching for our own versions of salvation.